Okay, welcome everybody. Today is March 13th, 2024. This is the Upper Dublin School District Finance Committee, and I will call the meeting to order. We don't have any formal presentations tonight, although there will be a presentation as part of one of the items. So we'll get right into the agenda. Any announcements, Mr. Lay?
Yeah, actually, I do have one announcement. I think it's important to note that we just found out that, or we just received confirmation that Sandy Run Middle School did receive its LEED Gold certification. So that was finally received. So I think that's good news for everyone to be aware of.
Absolutely good news. Thank you. We do have minutes from our February 21st meeting. Members of the committee have had a chance to review those. Is everyone prepared to approve those minutes?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Those will appear on the legislative agenda as an informational item. And we'll jump right into reports and recommendations, starting with traffic study agreement with TPD Professional Services.
Yes, thank you. So we are currently having regular meetings with ICS every 2 weeks to continue the planning for the proposed transportation facility project. So at our last meeting with ICS, we reviewed an immediate next step of having a traffic study completed, which again is something we had talked about through the process. And it's a requirement for land development with the township. So ICS did take the lead on that. They received 2 proposals for us to consider. One was from Traffic Planning and Design, which we have before us tonight. The other was from McMahon, but it's not McMahon anymore. So we did have 2 proposals that were considered. In the review with ICS, the recommendation is to move forward with the proposal before you, which is with Traffic Planning and Design. The total costs are $32,250 based on the scope of services. It is not a technically not to exceed amount, so you'll notice there's items that could come up that require further evaluation beyond this traffic study. There is some language in there that they have to get our approval for things that need to happen beyond the price that they quoted. But everything's defined in the proposal, and we feel it's a reasonable price. The scope of services is specifically defined on page 3 and 4, including all the locations of where they would do their evaluations at, where data will be collected. The proposal also notes, I think it's important just for everyone to realize and understand that there's an assumption for the trip generation and task 4 that relies on a traffic study that was done in September of 2018. So at that point in time, the transportation facility, there was a joint proposal between the school district and the township for the transportation facility on a similar site there. It actually was on the Field of Dreams. So at that point in time, there was a traffic study completed. It is 6 years old, but we did confirm that I've seen the study. There's the information in there, the number of runs we have, the timing is very similar. We did also confirm with traffic planning that we would also have an internal sit-down meeting before they start to note any differences between what was in that study. Again, from the trip generation, this is number of buses, the times they're leaving the site, things like that. So things haven't changed all that drastically since September 2018, but that will be the basis, and then we will meet with them so we can go through that and make sure it all still makes sense. Will note the terms and conditions in here have been reviewed by our solicitor. So what you see here is a draft. The solicitor made a number of changes that have been accepted since we just received the clean draft copy this morning. So that clean draft will be included on the legislative agenda. So the recommendation is to move forward with traffic planning and design for our traffic study for the proposed transportation facility.
All right, thank you. Any comments or questions from the committee? Alima?
Andy, did they talk to you about when or a time frame as to when they would complete the study? What time of day, what time of school day? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep, so this, it's all listed out in here, so all of the times of the study would be during a regular school traffic day. So they would obviously come out when a school day would be in session. The times associated with that are, again, directly from the 2008 study, but will be confirmed, so it'll cover when we're leaving in the morning, you know, when the majority of buses are leaving in the morning, when they're coming back to the site, when they're leaving in the afternoon, when they're coming back in the evening. So all that will be covered and is defined in here.
Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry, Jenna?
Sorry, not a question, but to that point, just for folks, you know, who may be following along, yeah, it's on page 3 of the professional services agreement, just because I know there's community interest in this topic, so I'll just make sure to point people to where to look. There is a section that talks about what times of day and what locations, so if folks have, interest in exactly the how that would be done. I mean, and the obvious point is it's going to be done during the school year, obviously. So, but yeah, I think those seemed pretty comprehensive to me. But in terms of the intersections, those seemed logical. But yeah, if anybody's interested.
And the only other thing I'll note on that is the one other thing we certainly can discuss is we did have conversations with them. While it's, we still would need approval from the township and there's still further evaluation that needs to happen there. What's not included here is if we would be able to utilize the access road that comes out to where if you come in on Highland and go straight up past where the township building will be, there's an access road that doesn't connect directly, but would be in line with where Spark Drive is. We could add that to this traffic study. They estimated if we add that, it could be about $3,000. Right now, it's not part of the study because it's just sort of a hypothetical. So it would really be up to us to decide if we want to add that or not. I think it might be worthwhile for $3,000, but it's certainly our call.
And I would absolutely think that we should include that. It would be helpful to know if that would make a big difference to anything, and if so, we can pursue it more aggressively with the township. And along those lines, are they aware that the township building construction will presumably still be going on at the time that they do the study, and take that into account appropriately?
I don't know that they know that, but I will certainly follow up and make sure they do.
All right, John.
So I was curious, is this just a one-day study, or do they repeat this? I don't know if traffic looks different on a Monday, then looks different on Wednesday, and there's variability in traffic patterns. So I'm just curious if this is a one-day study or if there's repeated.
I honestly don't know that. I know they would follow whatever the best practices are for completing a traffic study. Obviously, it would need to be presented to the township for them to consider and for them to make recommendations on things that need to happen. I don't know how many times they go through the process, though.
Itia.
Yeah, and along those same lines, whether it's a rainy day or a sunny day, I mean, I think that does make a difference in the way people utilize the access.
Certainly parent drop-off.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So these are just things to communicate with them in the intake meeting once we approve this, assuming we approve this. Anyone else? Jeff.
Andy, do we know approximately how long it takes for them to generate at least the initial report or findings?
I don't believe that's listed in the proposal, but we can certainly get a lot of those details.
It's
soon,
more just curiosity.
Yeah, as part of the intake meeting, we would learn all that
Right.
information, but we can certainly ask some of those questions.
But I assume if approved, we would do the intake meeting and get them going as soon as they can, kind of thing.
Yes, I mean, this is viewed as something critical as part of the project. So yeah, this would be done sooner rather than later, for sure.
Can we also get information around the crash data? Because it says here it's not included in the proposal. But I'd be interested to see what it would look like so that we can have as much information as possible during the traffic study.
Anyone else? Okay, so with all those comments noted, we're okay to move this ahead? Yes, okay, thank you. Moving on, we have summer maintenance work. Bob?
Yes, these are, we're presenting 3 RFPs that we have for summer work that we discussed at prior meetings. These are services that we're going out for while the schools are closed. It's for painting, and most of the schools, I'm not going to say all. Sandy Run's just a minor amount that we can handle in staff. Fort Washington was painted fully last summer, and with all the work at Thomas Fitzwater, it's very minimal. I think we're going to do some cafeteria work. That's about it. We'll do more painting as they finish up in the rooms. We just don't want to get in the way of Thomas Fitzwater this summer with all the work that is going on. But we'll take any care of anything in-house that needs to be touched up, so it does look clean when students return. We're doing pressure washing for Fort Washington and the high school, continuing those operations. And this summer we also picked Thomas Fitzwater is scheduled for concrete repairs, notably along the bus loop where the students are dropped off from the buses. We have a lot of blocks that are in poor condition, sinking and cracked, a curb in the back that we're adding a ADA cutout into that we had not had before, but was identified as a need. So all these jobs will be out for RFP and expect to bring those results back in May.
All right, comments or questions? Itya?
I think there was a time that some of that painting work was done by students. Is that still part of the, I mean, will that still be included in the RFP, or is that a practice we have?
No,
we don't use?
For 3 or 4 years now, we really haven't had any summer help. We have advertised. With just the market, we have not been getting the students, but it also requires, when we do have the students, and it requires a lot of our staff oversight, so we tend to get less done. We do have students that are doing projects, murals within the high school. They still doing those projects, but bringing on summer help, no. We have not, we just haven't had any luck over the past years. We're actually getting more done by contracting this work out.
Anyone else? Okay, do we need to formally approve these?
Now, this item and the next item are really just informational only.
All right, great, thank you. And let's move on to the paving bid.
And the paving, as part of our Jarrtown elementary playground renovations, last month we discussed a new piece of playground equipment. So after that equipment is installed, we're going to have, the equipment will have its own fall area, we call it, with a poured in place soft material around that particular piece of equipment. But we still have one piece to remove that is in poor condition, that's older. And then there's a lot of cracks and gaps. We've been making repairs to make it safe and playable. But after this new equipment's in and the old equipment is removed, it is time for a full coating. So this will be over our bid limit, so it won't be RFPs. We're expecting this to be a higher cost, so we do need to bid this. So this is to put in an overlay, 1.5 inch overlay over top of the existing pavement. And we're also going to take the opportunity to feather all the pavement in at the doorways that come in. So the doorways, there will not be a step down, it'll be a gradual sloped. So any students with accessibility needs will not have to worry about a step coming out of the classroom or coming out of the hallways.
Is this a coating or a mill and then?
No, this is strictly a coating. The pavement itself is tight. We've made repairs, so it is tight, so we're not worried about the subsurface. So it is a surface preparation, a cleaning, a tack coating, and then an overlay.
All right. Anybody else have comments or questions? Mary Beth?
Could that feathering address the main entrance that's not accessible? I doubt it could, but.
No, the steps at the main entrance are too high. I think we have 1 or 2 steps there. We'd have to come out probably about 12 feet to get the correct slope for feathering there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just every time these topics come up at Jarrtown, I really think we have to kind of move the conversation forward a little bit in terms of what's the plan, because, obviously work needs to continue. We can't just let Jarretttown hang out there. I mean, I have a kid at Jarretttown, obviously, so I'm personally interested in it. But, you know, at the same time, I want to make sure we're being thoughtful about what we are spending money on, given whatever the future plan is. And we really haven't come to any type of decision whatsoever, to be clear. But every time these come up, it always is in the back of my head of, are we spending money that, you know, we might not get full use out of? So I'm just going to put in the pitch for us to have that conversation
Yeah,
sooner rather than
not
later.
only have we not come to any conclusion there, we haven't even started the conversation. But I agree, we do need to start the conversation. In fact, I had that conversation yesterday with Lori. Yesterday? I think it was yesterday. Yeah. And yeah, I agree. But anything we do there is years away from, even if we started now, it would be years away from completion. And so this is the sort of thing, in my opinion, that has to happen either way. But I agree. We do need to get that conversation going. Any other comments? Okay. Thank you for that. Moving on to the Montco Public Safety Assessment.
So I'll field this one. As you know, the district hired a safety coordinator at the start of this school year, Mr. Shea Creamer. He's been doing a great job in the role and really working with our buildings. And as I have come on, the board, I think, is aware through my performance goals. One of the areas is safety, and one of the things we'd like to do is conduct an audit of the safety elements, the physical safety pieces of our 6 school buildings. And through the work with the Montgomery County Department of Public Safety, they actually conduct these assessments free of charge. They would do one building at a time, and they use the PCCD tiered system, where tier 1 is really, you know, the basic elements of school safety, and then you get to additional tiers of that. We would like to engage with them. There's no cost, but I think best practice would be to have the board approve that we're doing this. And what we'd like to do then, as we receive those results back, be able to use them to prioritize, to make an action plan, to help us assess what is the most emergent needs coming out of that to increase security and safety here in our buildings. And we would propose to start with the high school first, and then Sandy Run, and then move to our 4 elementaries. So again, no cost associated here, but I wanted to make sure that the board was aware and that you were supportive of this.
Comments or questions? Alima.
Thank you, Dr. Lori. How, once they do their assessment, is that information stored publicly, privately? Is it given to us in some type of a report? How does that work?
Good question. We will receive a report for each building. I've asked them to share that after each building because there will be a little bit of a lag till they get to all of them. So they'll share it after each building. And if I should have brought a sample, but if I picture it, it's a chart that will say, here's all of the tier 1 things, and we'll be kind of rated on that we can then use to determine where priorities might be. And they'll give us some recommendations as well. So we will receive a report for each one. And certainly after Mr. Creamer and I review, it's something we could provide summaries to the board if you would like that, or include in our, you know, in June we have to do a safety report to the board, as well as I think we have a district safety committee. That would be a great place to address some of those things too.
Anyone else? Jenna.
Just to set expectations for the community, though, we would not, I imagine, be sharing that publicly. This is a topic for executive session, so I don't want anybody to wonder, where are those reports that we all want to see? That's something we would not be disclosing publicly, I assume.
You are correct. That would be an appropriate exec session topic.
Any other comments or questions? All right, so action is not formally necessary on that, but it's been requested. So are we prepared to move that ahead to the legislative meeting and let the board vote on it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Andy, monthly financials.
Yes, thank you. So in the packet this evening are the typical monthly financials that we would run through. Again, everything is trending as we would expect from receipts and expenses. So I'm certainly not going to go through all the details of the report. There is an additional report in here that I do want to spend time on this evening, though. And then I'll certainly take questions if there are any specific questions on anything. So in the packet, I'm on page 43 of the packet. If you're looking at what was attached online, it is the item that is projections. So the 23-24 revenue and expense projections are what we're looking at. So the report looks a little different than we've looked at in prior years. Again, I'm always looking at how can I improve and make things easier to look at and review. So What you see here is a review of revenues, top section of this report, expenditures, bottom section of the report, and then on the left side you have budget, projection, and then what the variance is based on where I expect to be at the end of the year. So what the report includes are actual revenues and expenses from July through the end of February. And then it includes projected results from March through the end of June to get to the final projection number and the variance. So I do want to walk through some of this and talk through some of it to let you know where we're at and where we expect to be. So I'll start with the revenue section, which is at the top here. And you can see that the revenue section, similar to when we walked through the budget, is broken down into three main areas: local revenues, state revenues, and then federal or other revenues. The revenue variances shouldn't be a surprise here. We've been talking about them as part of our financial reports on a monthly basis. But where we're at on the local revenue, we're estimated to be about $1.8 million better than budget. And where that's coming from, there's a couple areas. So property taxes are actually trending about $800,000 under budget this year. And we talked about that specifically related to, we had one large commercial property that did not pay their taxes by the end of the penalty period, and we turned that over as delinquent. You will then also notice on the delinquent tax, we're about $337,000 under budget projected through the end of the year. But we have no idea who is going to pay delinquent and in what quantity, so it's very difficult to project that. What's in the projection is what we already know we've received. We get weekly emails from Portnoy, who does our delinquent tax collections, to let us know where we're at. I did note here that it is likely that that commercial property, because delinquent taxes do need to be paid at some point in time, will pay, and we will have a significant increase in that line item, because right now it's about $1.8 million that's due from the commercial property. We just have no idea when they are actually going to pay it. It could be this year before June 30th. It could be out into next year, so it's not projected at this point. Earned income tax, interim taxes. So this is primarily due to new assessments from new developments. Again, we've been talking about that. Similarly there, with new developments, we don't know when they will be assessed. We don't know how much. Like when we were going through Promenade, there was a quarterly assessment on that. We had no idea how much was going to come online and when, and that will ultimately drive interim taxes after property tax bills are released. Earned income tax continues to trend ahead of projections. We've sort of been narrowing in how we project earned income taxes, and what I'm finding, and you'll see in the budget presentation, is that using any type of look-back average is not accurate, because we're seeing wages continue to rise, and we're seeing the number of residences in the township continue to rise. So the trend continues upward. So we're looking at about a $600,000 increase in next year's budget to catch up to what we're projecting here of a $450,000 increase over the current year budget. So again, we'll talk more about that in the budget discussion. Interest is trending $1.5 million over budget. We budgeted at 3%. We're earning 5+%. You can see that in our investment report here. So that's driving that. And then you see our local other. On the state revenue side, so state revenue is trending about $155,000 better than budget. A large majority of that is due to two things. One was when we approved our budget at the end of last year, and that's going to be similar to the discussion we have tonight. The state budget was not yet approved. We did factor some of that increase into our budget, but we did receive significantly more than what we budgeted. So with basic education and special education funding, we're up about $400,000 compared to the budget. And then on the transportation funding, we're about $110,000 better. Again, that's based on a fairly complex calculation that goes into that subsidy. We do look at trends, but one of the things is the pandemic years did create some issues with that trend. So we are seeing about $110,000 increase, and that trend we built into the 24-25 budget. And then PSERS and FICA are under budget because when we get to expenses, that is a factor of wages. So PSERS and FICA subsidy is a 50% subsidy on the expense we pay for PSERS, which is the retirement system, and FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare. And then as wages are below budget, PSERS and FICA expenses below budget, revenue received from the state as subsidy is below budget. And then on the other revenue, there are two large things that happen here. So federal revenue is trending about $620,000 above budget. And $550,000 of that is related to the ECF funding for the Chromebooks that we discussed at last month's meeting. So that's built into the projections now on both revenue and expense. And then we've already talked about insurance proceeds that we received from the tornado damage. We received that this year. The board has already approved the transfer. So again, that's a wash on the revenue and expense side. But again, it shows variances on both sides of the ledger. So we're trending about $4.2 million better than budget on revenue, which is about a 3.5% variance to the budget. On the expense side then, you'll see that's broken down into two separate areas, right? One is personnel and then one is everything else. So I'll start with the personnel, which is wages and benefits. So the personnel budget is trending about $2.3 million below budget, which is 2.7% under the budget. So our wage budgets, and again, when we get to the expense budget next month, you'll see this, our wage budgets are created by budgeting for all approved positions. And that includes all known information through the approval of the final budget, including when we know there's retirements, when we know there's going to be leaves of absence like sabbaticals, we build that all into the budget. Wages then are 1.1 million under budget for a couple reasons. Right, so there's unplanned leaves of absences, so things we just don't know about that happen throughout the year. We have turnover throughout the year that occurs, and every time there's turnover, there's a window of time between when someone leaves and we hire that creates savings. And then again, that time to fill open positions creates savings there. So those are the reasons we are under budget on wages. And then benefits is $1.1 million under budget across all the benefit categories for similar reasons, right? So we last year talked about trying to rein that in a little bit, and with our medical benefits, we were budgeting for all open positions or new positions at family. But we saw that, most new folks that were coming in, especially the younger folks, were not taking full family benefits. So we scaled that back to, single as our assumption in the budget. So we're continuing to pull it in, but we're still off. And again, we have leaves of absence that drive benefits changes, reductions. We have turnover, we have open positions. And every time we have that, we have savings associated with it because we're budgeting for all of that in our budget. And then in other expenditures, a couple things to note there. So on the salaries, we have savings for, teachers and aides, teachers turnover and leaves, aides, open positions. But we are about $360,000 over budget for subs for both of those, which seems to make sense, right? We have savings on the salary and wage side. We have more subs in our buildings where we don't have long-term sub positions in place. Out of district tuition is currently about $291,000 under budget and is currently something we are working very closely with our new director of student services to just make sure that is 100% accurate and we're not missing any payments or open encumbrances that we need to make sure are included. Charter school tuition is down due to lower enrollment. So you'll see, again, when we do budget presentation on expenses next month, that's adjusted in the 24-25 budget. Transportation, we have fewer contracted needs for the MCIU and assist services. Again, another adjustment we've made in our budget for next year. General supplies are over budget by $440,000, which is primarily, again, due to what we talked about last month, the Chromebook purchase. So we talked about we don't have that budgeted. Even though it's a wash to the budget, it creates an impact on the expense side that we'll need to cover, but it's offset by ECF funding. The capital reserve transfer, so again, there's an agenda item tonight about the $3 million that we had budgeted for the capital reserve. So I've assumed in the projection that we will transfer that to the capital reserve, and it's over budget by the $1.5 million that was related to the insurance proceeds that we approved in September. And then all other expenses are trending about $1.7 million under budget. So right now we are projecting about a $6.1 million surplus at the end of the year for all of those reasons. I will note that again, these are all early estimates, and they will continue to be updated every month. We'll bring an updated report at the close of every month with a new month of actual, and then any projections that need to be updated through the end of the year. And then this work also informs all of our budget work that we're doing on both the revenue and expense side. And again, you've seen I've talked about some of that. You'll see some of that in the budget presentation that we go through tonight for revenue. So I will stop there and see if there's any questions.
All right, thank you. Any comments or questions on this new report or the regular treasurer's report or the other financials? Jenna?
Can you remind me what falls under other expenditures? Because that's a big item.
It's everything else that's in
Just
the budget.
everything,
I suppose, one of the big things that could be broken out, looking at that number, could be debt service would fall into that. So that's basically everything else that I haven't broken out to identify as what's causing a large variance.
But debt service is the biggest one?
Not for variance.
Not for variance, but the
piece of
biggest piece of what's in that $23 million number, right?
Okay.
So that would be, like I said, everything else in our expenditure budget that isn't captured in what I broke out.
Is there anything that comes to mind, though, that does account for that, any significant chunk of that 1.7 variance?
No, I mean, nothing specific, right? So that piece of it is probably the hardest to estimate what's going to happen through the end of the year, because that's everything else that's happening. That's all the purchases that still need to happen in buildings through the end of the year. That's all the utilities that we still need to pay. So there's a lot that's wrapped up in that. So I don't think that number will be $1.7 million at the end of the year. That's probably the hardest one to estimate of all these items.
Okay. And then you kind of took the words out of my mouth, which is, I think this is really helpful going into the revenue and then the expenditure discussions, because I think we did some good work last year, kind of tightening up some of those projections, and I see some of them already noted for this year. So that's just going to be part of a continuous evolution. That's a drum I beat every year, and I think we're making progress, but still, room to kind of tighten these, because that, of course, informs ultimately, when we talk about tax increases, et cetera. So yeah, I think I can't remember if we did this time last year, but this is really helpful, like, again, going right into those discussions. So thank you for this.
Anyone else? Is that a finger, Jeff? No. Titia?
Yeah, two things. I would like to see the debt service separated out of this, just for clarification. I think that's an important thing for us to know and to keep an eye on. So if we could have that separated out. The other thing, and this is more terminology semantics, to talk about savings when we're talking about wages. Yes, there is a savings, but if you think of savings as good, in this sense, I feel it's a discontinuity. And while, from a budget perspective, I think it is savings. But from an operations perspective, I'm not so sure it's savings. I don't know if there's a better term for it. But I struggle a little bit with calling this savings. But that's probably just more of a conceptual thing.
And I think, maybe I used the word savings and that might not be, but, I think the main takeaway here is that this is a report to show variance to budget.
It's unrealized expenses.
Yeah.
Which, in some ways is exactly the same thing. But in the context of the business the district is in, which is teaching students, if we don't spend on teachers, that's not always a positive.
And I would say,
I don't want there to be the message out there, oh, well, they want to save money, so we don't hire quickly. We hire as quickly as we can, and we try and be proactive. So I just wanted to bring that up.
yeah, fair enough. And I think the other thing I'll say to that, I don't think it has anything, we are not actively trying to generate any savings by not filling positions, right? And I think an easy example there, just a simple example of what else might create savings here for a leave of absence would be if a teacher goes out on leave and they're at the top of the salary schedule, right, $120,000, and then we hire an LTS at the, a lower range on the salary schedule, let's say $60,000, $70,000. That right there, even though we've filled the position, we've made sure there's a teacher in front of students doing the work that we do. That generated $50,000 in savings, budget variance, just on the wage line item, and then that trickles through. So.
No, exactly. I just wanted to highlight that component.
And on those lines, just in terms of separating out debt service, I certainly have no problem with separating it out here. In years when, correct me if I'm wrong, in years where we neither issue new debt or refund any debt, the variance ought to be zero, right?
Correct. So I think the only thing that's happening is 23 million looks like a large number. So if it's helpful to break that out, just so 23, you see that debt service, but yes, you won't see a variance there per se.
No, there should not be any surprises there at all, but just as a number to keep our eyes out for them.
Any other comments or questions on any of these reports? Okay, thanks for those. We'll move those ahead. Yes, all right, thank you. And the aforementioned transfer to capital reserve.
Yeah, so tonight, what I'm bringing forward is similar to what we did last year. So the first of what will likely be two recommendations for transfers to the Capital Reserve Fund for the 2023-24 fiscal year. So the current budget includes an appropriation for a planned transfer to the Capital Reserve of $3 million included in our budget. As we discussed tonight, you can see that our projections are trending positively. So we have a positive outlook for the end of the current fiscal year. So at this point, I am comfortable making the recommendation to move forward with that transfer as the board had planned in the budget. The memo attached to the agenda provides all the key information to support this recommendation. And it's beyond just because this is approved in the budget. It's more because the budget is trending towards a surplus. So again, I think waiting, the timing of it had to do with let's not do this first thing at the beginning of the year because we don't know what the year is going to bring. If we needed that flexibility for any reason, we had it. But at this point, I feel like we're in a solid position to make that transfer as planned. Page 3 of the memo lays out the financial plan for the Capital Reserve Fund and the list of projects that are either in process or anticipated over the next 5 years as presented at the December Finance Committee meeting. So again, I want to keep that at the forefront that we're not just moving, we're not making recommendations to move money just to move money. We have real work that needs to be done. There's a number of projects that are in queue, and then there are a large list of items that need to happen over the next 5 years. That is the reason we're setting money aside. So if approved, this transfer will provide the funding needed to support basically all of those projects that we have laid out, all but $1.5 million of known capital projects, except for the transportation facility, Fort Washington landscaping improvements, which is currently being planned with ICS, and we hope to bring something forward in the near future to start having those discussions. And then the Thomas Fitzwater, we're doing above the ceiling renovations, but at some point, again, Jarretttown is on that list as the renovations that were in the facility condition assessment. The number that was part of that, obviously, as we discussed tonight, there needs to be further discussion on if there's renovation to that building or something else. And then Fitzwater will at some point need a below the ceiling renovation. But again, I think that's subsequent to the items that are on the list. So it's also important to note that Capital projects will not end at the end of this 5-year window. That's our 5 years, sort of our look forward to make sure we're projecting out what needs to be done and planning appropriately for it. Our capital projects will go on and on and on and on because we have 300 million plus in district facility assets that need to be taken care of and maintained. And again, additionally, when essential projects like this can be funded with cash, that means we're earning interest on deposits rather than paying interest on borrowing. Again, I note that I'm not anti-borrowing, but again, the more we can fund with cash, I think the better off we would be. So the recommendation is to move forward with a transfer of $3 million to the Capital Reserve Fund as budgeted.
Comments or questions? Just one quick one. Can you just clarify the colors in the document? For example, down toward the bottom, we have the high school softball field improvements, which we've approved to, we haven't actually gotten bids back yet. Is that why that one's still red?
Yes, correct. So anything yeah, thank you. Anything in black is actual. Anything in red is projected. Anything in blue is what's already approved. So yes, the softball field has not been approved yet. That's sort of just a placeholder. So once it's approved, I would change it to blue and know that's active.
Right. Any Titia?
Yeah, I think we also, if I have to remember that when we talked about doing this later in the year, it was because we didn't have a state budget yet, right?
You mean about when the timing to make the transfer?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
We could do it at any point. The timing of it was related to making sure I don't think it was related to the state budget. I think from my perspective, it's waiting till I feel comfortable that the year is projecting as we anticipated. Because again, the board could utilize, if something unexpected came up, we could make a transfer of those funds to cover it. But at this point, we're projecting at a point where I feel very comfortable that we can move that as planned.
Yeah, no, agreed. But I think early at the beginning of the year, we weren't ready to do any of this because we didn't know yet where the state budget, yeah, amongst other things.
Yeah, amongst other things, like everything that's in that projection document, right. I think. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It was clearly a very big piece that was unknown at the time, but certainly not the only unknown. Anyone else? All right, so we'll move that ahead?
Yes.
Yes, all right, thank you. Budgetary transfers.
I don't have anything specific to note other than obviously what we talked about tonight. There are no direct impacts to the budget as a result of any of these transfers, but certainly if there's anything specific you want us to address, we'd be happy to.
Anyone have comments or questions on the budget transfers? All right, we'll move that ahead?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. All right, showtime.
Yeah, so the revenue presentation. So again, I think Ms. Evans said it correctly. You know, this is a presentation, and Mr. Sirota noted that it was later in the agenda. I prefer not to do this at the top of the agenda because everything we've discussed through the meeting leads up to sort of understanding some of the things that are in this presentation. So leading with some presentation at the top of the meeting could lead to some of the questions that I hope I've already addressed in here. But yes, what we'll do tonight is begin our detailed discussions of our 4 months towards a final budget in June. Each of the next 4 Finance Committee meetings will include presentations on the 2024-2025 budget. There it goes. Okay, so we always start with a timeline, and I think it's important just to see where we've come, right? So while we're just starting the discussion around budget for 24-25, towards the final budget, we've been through quite a bit of budget discussions already this year, right? We take a bit of a hiatus from December through February, but at the beginning of the year in September, we already started talking about what our assumptions were for the budget. We went through a preliminary budget process. The board approved the opt-out resolution to stay under the approved Act 1 index for the year. So we've done quite a bit of work already, and now what we'll do through the end of the year is we will have a revenue presentation tonight. Next month, we will have a deep dive into the expenditures in our budget for next year. And then May will be a discussion of what's changed from the March and April budgets to the proposed final budget. And then we'll move forward to June and have a final budget discussion. So as we develop the budget, there's a number of competing priorities that are considered, which essentially boils down to a focus on providing the resources needed to achieve a quality K-12 educational program, and doing so in a fiscally responsible way. This hasn't changed much. These are our priorities. They continue to be our priorities, and this is what we look to as we're going through the budget development process. So I'd like to just keep this in here as a reminder on a year-to-year basis. So diving into the numbers, the revenue summary, so we're looking at a total revenue projection for next year of $120,570,125. And you can see this represents a 2.5% increase, or a little over $2.9 million as we look at the budget. And again, similar to how the projection report is set up, it's broken apart into a couple different areas, right? We have our local revenues, we have state revenues, and then we have federal and other revenues. And I'll note here, again, I'll go through it. Locals, 3.1 million increase. State is about a 650,000 increase. And the large decrease on federal is related to the ESSER funding, which we're going to utilize this year, one-time funding, which will not be in our budget moving forward. So again, we have three main areas where district revenues come from. Local revenues by far make up the largest portion of our district budget. That is not the same for all districts across the state, so it's really district by district. I think ours is on the higher side with local revenues making up 81.3% of our overall budget. And then when you look at that, property taxes make up about 71% of our total budget, or 86% of our total local revenues. And then when you add the property taxes and EIT together, that makes up almost 94% of our budget. So you can see on the chart on the left kind of shows you that breakdown. The chart on the right shows revenue growth over the, looking back to the 1920 year and projecting forward to 24-25, we've seen an average revenue growth rate of about 3.5% per year. Again, not all that coming from property taxes, some of that being driven by some of the other areas that we've seen, like earned income tax and interim taxes. So this slide then breaks down some of the more details. Again, you'll see the chart on the left here gives some more details around the local sources of revenue. And again, you see by far here, property taxes make up the vast majority of our local sources of revenue, the vast majority of the entire district revenue. And again, EIT shows up on this chart. Everything else is really so minor. And I show that again as an example just to understand that how much of our district revenue sources are made up of property taxes, so you can get a sense. And again, this is what I said here, property taxes and EIT together make up about 94% of all local revenue. So we are heavily reliant on those two areas of our revenue budget. So what you see here is the changes, a comparison of the 23-24 budget to the 24-25 budget, and then the variance with some notes. And again, some of these I'm going to get into, there's additional slides on them, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but you can see where I noted here areas of EIT as an example. The current year EIT trend is 7.4, so we're estimating 7.5 next year. Interest income is based on a 3% interest rate, so just having some assumptions in there. I think when you look at something like interest income, it's interesting because interest income is we're earning over 5% right now, but I think the trend, the Fed would rather be around 2 to 3% for the Fed funds rate. So I think interest rates over time will come down. So I think we have to be very careful here about how we handle interest rates in our budget. We're earning far more than 3% now, but if we budget at 5% and it comes to zero, or 3%, it was zero for almost a 10-year stretch where we were earning very little interest. There's a lot of risk there, and that's why I take a more conservative approach. We can certainly go higher, we could go lower, but if anyone has a crystal ball about where interest rates are going to be a year from now, I'd be interested in having a more detailed conversation there. And then with the state items, again, we have no idea where the state budget is going to be next year. We probably won't know by even May, but again, we'll come up with some assumptions. Right now, what's in the budget, and again, I have a slide about what's in the governor's proposed budget. Right now, it just anticipates flat to where we are current year projection. Again, we'll go through some of that in more detail. So this is a standard chart I show every year. You can see that we track historical Act 1 index, which is the blue line, and then actual district tax increases, which is the orange line, again, through 24, 25, and then projection moving out forward. So the Act 1 index has been calculated, as I noted, by the state. It's 5.3% for the 24-25 year. Future years are projections that are generated by the state independent fiscal office. So we plug those in there, but again, those are only projections and they will change over time. But I think it's important to note that even though it's trending down, it's still significantly higher than where the Act 1 index has historically been. So, and that's driven by statewide average weekly wages and the federal employment cost index, which again are both measures of inflation, which will remain high over the next couple of years. Not necessarily, I'm not projecting inflation. The calculation that is used for that Act 1 index is, it looks back a bit. So we've got years of high inflation that are helping to drive that. And again, wages continue to move up moving forward. So district tax increases have been below that Act 1 index since the 2017-18 year and are projected to stay that way in the 5-year projection window, at least as we've been using a 2% placeholder in our future projections in our budget. I do want to make sure I point out, and this is an important point for everyone listening to walk away with tonight. So the current version of our revenue budget, when you look at those local revenues, includes only a 2% placeholder for a property tax increase, which aligns to what we have been using in our future projections. During the development of the preliminary budget, you may remember, I discussed a tax increase of 3.61%, but as stated during those discussions, that was never meant to be a recommendation, right? What that number represented in the preliminary budget was for the board to decide to proceed with either a full preliminary budget, proving the need for a tax increase beyond that 5.3% tax Act 1 index, or approving an opt-out resolution confirming that the final budget would remain at or below the Act 1 index. So 3.61% was simply the calculated number that we used based on all the assumptions built into the preliminary budget that we needed to balance the budget, both revenues and expenses. And to make sure the board knew that in approving the opt-out resolution, the board would never need to consider a tax increase beyond 5.3%. So the placeholder now is being used because the draft expenditure budget is not complete yet. So that's something we're still working on and finalizing. And again, that'll be part of the presentation at next month's meeting. And the final recommendation for the tax increase could either be higher or lower than 2%. Based on achieving a structurally balanced budget when the final budget is approved. So again, 2%, not a recommendation, 2% simply placeholder because we're still developing the budget. More information will come forward. So this gets into some of our real estate tax detail, just to make sure it's very clear about what's driving our real estate or property taxes. So these tables provide the details of our real estate budget as compared to the current year budget to reconcile where the $2.65 million increase is coming from on property taxes. So as mentioned, we've got a 2% placeholder in the budget, which generates about $1.7 million in new revenue. New developments that have come online have generated almost $1 million in new revenue. And then there's two lines there for commercial, which are broken down into two pieces. One is for adjustments which are already approved and in the county assessed value amount. And the second is projection or projected, which includes the worst case scenario for open assessment appeals. Both of those numbers include both positives and negatives. So the property owners that received reductions through appeals and district initiated appeals that will result in increase that have already or will result in increases. So we're doing some of those projections as well with assessments. You can see tornado damage represents the increased assessments that we've seen tornado damage homes come back online to their full assessments. Yes, that is still happening this year. And then two other points to note are that for every 0.1% of change, so we're at 2%, if it increases to 2.1, that would add about $87,000. Same thing, if it moves to 1.9, that would remove about $87,000 in revenue. And then again, a 2% tax increase, just as a matter of reference, would increase the taxes for a home at the median assessed value by $148. So how has assessed value been trending over time? This just gives you a sense of what we've seen over time. You can see the chart on the left shows from 16-17 to 24-25 where we've been and where we are at for the 24-25 budget. You can see before growth from new developments, there was almost no growth in assessed value from 2016 to 2021. Since that time, we've been growing around 1.3%. Primarily driven by all the new assessment from new developments. When these new developments are complete, it's likely that growth will slow dramatically. So again, there's a slide around new developments. We're aware of one more that's going to be significant next year. There's obviously more that are out there in the pipeline. We saw that in our enrollment projection discussion that we had last month. So again, we're paying attention to what's happening in the future. But this is why it moves back to zero, is it's mainly because about 80% of our township assessments come from residential properties. And then the other 18% is commercial. And we are seeing, you'll see there's one on the agenda tonight, which was already known, but we're seeing pretty substantial reductions in assessments for some commercial properties that are filing appeals. I think that's likely to continue into the future. So even though we're seeing some increases, we are losing on the other side of that. But again, the trend has been positive over the last 4 years, but I do expect that to slow a bit. One risk area, again, that I continue to note and I don't want to lose track of is that we have now one company that is responsible for, right now, after including the stipulation that it's on the agenda tonight, they're responsible for 3.8% of the district tax revenue. So BET Investments owns the Promenade, 200 Dryden, and Prudential, the old Prudential building. They used to make up 4.8% of our total assessment. Now it's 3.8% after the reductions for Dryden and Prudential, which is on the old Prudential, which is on the agenda for tonight. So having one property owner make up that amount of our total assessment that regularly appeals their assessment on their properties is certainly something that we need to continue to pay attention to. So new developments, I want to make sure to talk about this. There are, 3 that we're aware of and continue to be open and actively have assessments that need to come in against them. So Promenade is basically done, but there are still some unfinished assessments that we're expecting there based on what the anticipated assessed value at full build out was. So we'll continue to monitor that, but we've brought in about $5.1 million in new revenue from the new developments. There's about $840,000 remaining if everything comes in as projected. The other thing that we continue to have discussions with the township, again, I mentioned, so we've got 1125 Virginia Drive that has 310 apartments as part of that project. We know that when that's built out, the estimated assessed value is about $42.8 million, again, assessed value on that property. So we'll continue to monitor. What we don't know, again, is how quickly it will be built, how quickly it will be assessed, how quickly that assessed value will come on the books and turn into assessed value or turn into interim property taxes next year. But we will continue to monitor that with the township and make adjustments as needed. So earned income tax, again, is one area that we continue to see trend very positively to the budget. I had, as I sort of referenced, we have been previously using, it was a 5-year average, then I cut it back to a 3-year average, and you can see this year we're trending ahead of budget. And what I'm recommending, or what I've used in this preliminary budget, is as we're in an environment of continued wage increases, we're seeing, again, when apartments and new developments come online, we have more people living here that are generating earned income tax. I don't think looking back and using an average is the right way to do this. So in discussions with Berkheimer gave us a recommendation. They do projections for us. They've projected 7.45 to 7.55 as their recommendation. So I've come in right in the middle and said, we're going to use $7.5 million for next year for earned income tax in the budget. And you can see what this chart shows you here is the line all the way on the right is the actual budget with the 7.5 projection. You can see that sort of completes the trend upward. The line right to the left of that is if we used a 3-year average. So you can see where that drops down, and that's really not making sense. So in order to continue to get better and make sure we rein in some of those variances, my recommendation is 7.5 million there for next year, and that's why. Transfer tax, on the other hand, is just completely unknown. So transfer tax, again, comes from the transaction of properties. We monitor that. There's a report as part of our other financial reports, just like earned income tax, that shows what's happening. You can see that we've seen significant slowdown in the number of transactions for properties, but we are still trending right in line right now towards $1.2 million, which is our budget. So the budget for next year right now includes $1.2 million, and I feel very comfortable at that amount. You can see that average line is much higher because of the 21-22 year when we had a number of large commercial property transactions that year. So obviously that is not a regular occurrence. So we factored that out in what we're recommending for a budget next year. Okay, so for state revenue, I think, as I mentioned, it's typical at this point of the year that we don't really know very much about the state budget or what we should make as an assumption for next year. But until further guidance comes out, basically what we're using is we're taking where we're at this year, what our allocation is for this year based on the current year state budget, and using that as our placeholder, so to speak, looking forward. The only thing that changes is the PSERS and FICA. So the PSERS state pension system, FICA, Social Security, and Medicare is a reimbursement of expenses. So as our expense side of the budget changes, that number will change to be 50% of whatever our projected expenses are. So that will change along the way. And again, I mentioned the state budget was not approved. So, last year when we created our budget, hopefully the state budget will be approved before June this year. Again, we have a June 30, the board has a June 30 deadline to approve their budget. The state, I think, technically does, but there's nothing holding them to that June 30 date. So, this past year was August 8th or August 4th, I believe it was. August 4th was the date that they approved their budget. So we really have no control over that process. But what we do know, again, we know a little bit about what's in Governor Shapiro's budget proposal. And I note proposal because it's very, I can't think of a time where the final budget mirrored exactly what was in the governor's proposal. But we do know some of the things that are included in their proposal just from an awareness standpoint here. So if you listen to it, it is available. Governor Shapiro did present his second budget as governor, and this is what was included. You can see it would all be very positive for education for the most part here. If it was approved as is, Upper Dublin would see an additional $141,000 in basic education funding and $54,000 in special education funding. And it's also important to note that second line item on the left there, which is the budget proposal includes a new investment in basic education funding for a new adequacy investment formula, which begins to address the outcome of the fair funding lawsuit that occurred. So the state has been having a lot of discussions, a lot of committee around that, and this is the governor's recommendation. Upper Dublin, as well as 83 other school districts across the state, 13 in Montgomery County, will not receive any additional funding through that line item, just because of the factors that play into that, which again, we don't know all of them, but our wealth factor basically makes us ineligible for that adequacy funding increase. A number of other items that are interesting to follow, you can see here. The proposal includes continued funding of PCCD grants for mental and physical safety, school environmental repair projects, educator talent and recruitment, student teacher stipends, all good stuff. And then the budget proposal does include the concept of a reduced tuition rate for cyber charter students. Again, the concept there being is that right now, cyber charter schools receive the same tuition funding rate as brick and mortar schools, and that cyber schools have significantly less costs in operating virtually. So the proposed rate is $8,000 per student. You can see our tuition rate is about $18,000 per student. So it would be a saving, if that ended up going through, it would be a savings of about $10,000 per student. We don't yet know, so that's the regular education tuition rate. We don't yet understand how that may impact, if at all, students that are at charter schools receiving special education services. So certainly more to come there, and we will pay attention to that. But again, I think the takeaway here is governor proposal, there's 4 months likely worth of state negotiations that need to happen before a budget is approved. So in total, we receive around $22 million from state revenue. And again, this lays out the multiple sources of revenues that we receive. But it's important to notice that almost all of the state revenue sources have minor increases here, but the largest revenue source by far is related to PSERS, the pension system, the subsidy that we receive. So again, we pay an expense, we get a subsidy back. So that's the largest piece of revenue. And I think that's pretty typical for districts across the state. And also, while it's not likely, it is possible to receive less funding in a future year than you did receive this year with some of the funding formulas. So again, it's not likely because there's typically an increase to the amount of money put into the formula, but it is possible to receive less. And again, lesser items, so federal revenue, again, not that it's lesser, it is important to our overall budget, but it's minor, less than, probably about 0.5% of our budget is made up of federal or other revenues. So we are projecting federal revenues, so title revenues project flat to current year. And then as I mentioned, ESSER funding will be fully expended by the end of this year. So we don't have anything built into next year's budget because it was one-time revenue. So the next 3 slides have a lot of numbers on them, and they are really for reference only. So for anyone interested in those details, I don't intend to walk through all of those. So you have a local revenue slide with all the details. Again, it's got actual information with projected for budget, and you have the same for state and federal. I will also note that once we get to a proposed final budget, there is also a almost 30-page narrative document that comes out with all of the details that sits behind both the revenue and expense portions of our budget. So all of that information will be available. But again, these slides are for reference only. And certainly if there's questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer them on those slides. The last 3 slides, again, these are sort of dated, but I leave them in here just as reference. And if we get updated information through Forecast 5, so we have information to access to information through Forecast 5. And I think sometimes we hear comparisons of millage rates. between our district and other districts. So these were really just slides, I think, that help to put some of those comparisons into perspective. I know it doesn't answer all of the questions, but it at least helps guide some of that conversation. And the slides really lay out into three pieces here. So this is millage rates as compared to some of our local districts. And again, this is 22-23 just because that's what's available in Forecast 5 right now. They will be updating it in the near future. But I think the story is not going to change much with the way these comparisons lay out. So it's not really easy to compare millage rates across counties. But within county, you can do some comparisons here. And that's what this lays out. I also note that with our millage rate, 3.025 of our mills were approved through the referendum. So again, it's not meant to be anything more than just understanding what makes up our millage rate here. So Upper Dublin, we're kind of right in the middle of surrounding districts after factoring out that 3 mills of the voter referendum. But I point to Colonial, Upper Marion, and Wissahickon just because when you flip through the slides, you kind of see what's happening here. So those are the lowest millage rates on here when you compare just millage rate. As you flip to the next slide, you can see that those 3 that were the lowest in millage also have the highest assessed values within their district. So again, I'll just flip back and you can see those 3 become the highest. And Upper Dublin is boxed out there so you can see where we're at. So now you can start to get the sense of, okay, millage, where's millage? How does assessed value compare across the districts? But again, that in and of itself is not really a fair comparison. It's just one piece of the total understanding here. And then when you flip to the next slide, because a district may have significantly more assessed value because they're much larger, this slide really gets into then assessed value by or per pupil. So again, seeing assessed value by itself doesn't tell the full story. This chart provides more apples to apples. You can see how much assessed value each district has per enrollment within their district. So again, just doing a comparison to Wissahickon as an example, their millage is 22.45 as compared to ours, again, on these slightly outdated charts, 36.86. Wissahickons assessed value per student is around $750,000 versus ours, which is $600,000. So Wissahickon does not need as high of a millage to generate the same amount of revenue per student because of that difference. So again, it's not anything more than just data that can be referenced just as a matter of comparison. And again, I will update them when that information is updated. So to wrap this up, at this point of the budget process, we're typically at the same point. We have a revenue budget based on trends and assumptions, as I discussed tonight. There are lots of unknowns. There are lots of things that we will continue to learn, and we will update in our budget as we move through the end of the year, right? So we're 3 months until we approve a final budget. You can see, again, we have a 2% placeholder in the budget, but that's nothing more than a placeholder at this point in time. So whatever that ends up being will create a change to the budget. Assessment appeals and tax reductions associated could have significant impacts. New developments and assessments. We'll continue to monitor how much of that, what we know about the timing, if we need to build any of that in or not. And then state and federal revenues, we'll continue to monitor that and update it as needed. And again, each month we bring this back. So next month will be a dive into expenses, but we will bring back if there's any updates to this revenue so you can then see how that starts to piece together total revenues compared to total expenses, and it will just build as we move until June. So from my perspective, in summary, our revenue story is stable. There's some near-term growth that we're certainly seeing. It's unlikely that revenue will continue to grow at the same rate that we've seen over the last couple of years, but right now it's stable in what we're projecting moving forward. And again, next month we'll look at expenses and we'll continue forward. So that is my presentation on revenue, and I'm certain there are questions that I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the committee. Who's got questions? Lima.
So thank you, Andy, for that presentation. It's nice to see that the school district is in a healthy financial standing. I did have a question. So if you think about slide 4, where we're showing a total revenue change of 2.5%, but we are anticipating around a 2% increase. And if we look at slide 9, the total revenue is around 2.6, whereas the increase is around 2.9. How do we make up the difference from the 2.9 to 2.6?
Are you saying on the, like, property taxes are going, that slide shows a 2.6% increase?
So if I'm looking at page 4,
Yep.
right, we have a 2.5%. What was that? Yeah, total revenue.
Yep.
An increase of 2.5%, right?
That's correct.
I understand
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then we're looking at just a 2% increase on page 9. So we're looking at the reconciling of the revenue. So 2.6 million. So we're going to be at 2.9 million, but we're at 2.6. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So comparison page 4 to comparison page 9.
So page 9 is just one piece of what's on page 4, right? Page 6 is just the real estate. So this slide here, page 9 is just that top line.
Okay.
Right, so that's the difference there. Again, there's some rounding, but page 9 is just that top. Page 4 is everything that's on this list.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. All right, I think that clarifies it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff?
Andy, thank you for this. First of all, very detailed, a lot of info. Thank you. Couple of questions. On assessment appeals, obviously you say that is an unknown, and you noted there's 12 open now, 4 possible negative, 8 possible positive. When we do the budget, or when you do the budget, are assessment appeals factored in only if they're pending, or do you do like an assessment saying over a 3-year average we see these types of trends and factor that in, or is it not factored in at all? How does that factor?
Yeah, so the only thing that I include in here is what we know, like what's in front of us, and I think that's reasonable, because what we know is the only thing that would impact our budget next year per se, as of the end of the year. What can happen is then over the summer, owners can appeal their assessment again, but that wouldn't take effect until the following budget year. So I only include what's in front of us right now, what we know could happen, either what's happened already or what we know could happen. That's in our queue. We don't project forward, because likely anything new that comes up next year would be for the following year budget.
Okay, appreciate that. On EIT, I find it interesting how it goes up sort of dramatically. We hear talk these days about the tension or the conflict between hybrid work, remote work, in-office work, and how that may or may not be shifting. I mean, I look at like the mayor of Philadelphia, who's sort of starting to order people back, at least for the government, if not recommending it for private businesses. Does the literature or the chatter say that has any impact at all on EIT, or is EIT really insulated? And I'm trying to process in my head that if you work in one place but you pay a tax to another place, does that matter at all, do you think, or is EIT sort of insulated from wherever that tension winds up? Does that make sense as a question?
So I think the only place that matters is if someone works in Philadelphia, because there is an additional withholding for folks that live in Philadelphia. We don't necessarily see all of that. So I don't know that the work from home has created any other issues there. I think you can see from this chart that we've just seen, we've seen EIT go up. And again, I think what's the other piece that's driving this is we have new developments. We've got more people living in the township. So we're seeing that. But yeah, the only place that really impacts us if more people go back to work into the city, we would start to see impacts to our earned income tax revenue.
Okay, gotcha. Appreciate that. I appreciate at the end your comment that, you know, revenue is stable, and then you put a qualifier that it may not, I guess, increase as much out into the future. I'm paraphrasing your words. And I assume that your qualifier there is based on the things you've talked about, things like interest rates coming down, the unknowns of assessment appeals, and factors like that. Is that a fair characterization?
I think all of that and new developments probably aren't going to generate as much revenue as they have in the past. So we've had a lot of new development over the last 3 years, and so all of those things you said and the slowdown of development.
Thanks so much.
Jenna.
I have a couple. So first one, just piggybacking on the EIT. So did Berkheimer take into account the, you know, increased developments or just the projection in terms of wage increases?
Yeah, I don't think they have a way to project who's going to move in and what type of incomes they'll bring with them. So it's only really looking at who's currently paying, which again is another reason why looking back and using averages doesn't make sense either. So.
Yeah, because I mean, I feel pretty good about the 7.5 projection. I mean, that's a pretty decent increase over the 6.9 we have in this year's budget, and I think it was 5.9, almost 6 the year before. So we've really been ratcheting that up, which is, I think, good because again, we're trying to get these numbers as accurate as possible. So, yeah, I mean that's my only question mark on the EIT, I guess, is, again, I think that's a good point that we have all these new developments coming online, and I don't know how to project for it, but I like the trajectory anyway. So that's one I feel pretty good about it, but I still have a little bit of a question mark. You mentioned interest assumption. So we have it, the current revenue projection is at 3%, right? Was last year, what was the percentage? Was it 3% last year too? Okay. Yeah, this is another one I have a question mark about, and I don't have a crystal ball for what rates are going to be, but I read, you know, several articles about it. So I might advocate to tweak this to 3.5%. What I've been seeing is the projection is this year would be in the 4s, which is half of the school year where, you know, and then it would kind of taper down to in the 3s. So I'm kind of on the fence on that one, but I don't disagree with maybe keeping it at 3 for now, and of course this is all subject to change, but that's when I might advocate to increase that assumption slightly. So another question I had was, can you talk about, on slide 18, we show a reduction in the budget for interim real estate taxes. What is it, the second line down?
Yes, and I do think that's one so that gets back to us monitoring with the township what they think is going to happen. So I think that number reflects what would typically happen in a year without new developments. I think that could increase. And again, what we did last year, we looked at how much we thought was possible to come in each month, because again, it's prorated. So if something comes online in July, then you get 12 months worth of interim tax. If something comes online in January, then you only get 6 months worth of interim tax, and so on through. So you have to not only decide how much is going to be assessed next year, but then when it's actually going to happen throughout the year. So I do think that's a placeholder that we'll have to dial in as we move towards the end of the budget process.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, look, at this point, I think it's premature, I think, to weigh in on the 2% placeholder, because we're looking at it in a vacuum without seeing the expenditures, which of course we'll talk about next month. So I know that's the, no pun intended, $1 million question, but I don't think it does us much good to hem and haw about that yet, having not really dug into the expenditure. So I agree with that as a placeholder for now, and then, you know, we'll beat it up when we talk about expenditures.
Right. My intent on that right now, after consultation with Andy, is after we see the expense presentation next month, after next month's finance committee, I'll poll the board to get a sense for a broad area of where we are. We won't be able to nail anything down, but that'll at least inform Andy's May presentation about what his ultimate recommendation is, or range of recommendations depending on where we land. So he'll have that input to make his recommendation, and then we'll talk about it at the May finance. All right. Anyone else have questions? Titia.
Yeah, I just want to highlight slide number 4, the loss of the ESSER funding. That is not a surprise at all. I mean, that's been very clearly all along. You have made that very clear that is funding we get for a couple of years, and then that's the end. So that is not a substantial change in anything. It's been a nice to have, let's put it that way. But it's not something that's sort of really a big piece in our budget. So that drop of 70% or 71 almost is not a structural change at all. It's just, yeah, that's what the numbers are. But the reality is we knew about this and we have planned very much accordingly. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's an important piece to consider. So thanks for doing that.
And if I think that's one important add-on to that is, yes, good note there. You will also see on the expense side of the budget a corresponding reduction on the expense side as well. So yeah, it's no impact overall to the budget.
Anyone else? John.
Thanks, Andy, for all this. This is really helpful information. I was looking at slide 9, and it has a line item there for PA gaming tax relief, and we've got 2.9 the current year and projection of 2.9 the future year. When do we find out what that actual number will be?
Yeah, I'm not sure the date off the top of my head. I want to say it's the end of April or the beginning of May. And again, that's simply a pass through to any properties that are approved for the homestead or farmstead reduction. But yes, that number can go up or down, but yeah, we typically find out the end of April, early May.
Right, and to clarify that particular item, as Andy said, it's a pass-through, so there will be a corresponding exact expense. So it's a zero, but it does show up on the revenue side and on the expense side. And because it's a pass-through, in my opinion, there have been times when there have been big changes year to year, but we can't, in my opinion, we can't factor it into our decisions at all. It just happens to pass through our budget, but it's not in any way our money to factor in. Did you have anything, Mary Beth? No, you don't have to.
I have tons of questions, but I think I'm going to learn a lot as the process goes on. The one thing that keeps running through my head is with the new development. I know that we keep hearing that there's not estimated to be tons of new students related to the new development, but would that, like, projection of some new pupils and pupil related expenses be projected on the revenue side or the expenditure side? Sorry.
So I don't. So we heard, last month we talked a little bit about this with the demographic study, right? So yes, I don't think any of the developments that were on that report are bringing new students, right? It's the 1125 Virginia Drive that in the demographic study showed some significant increases in students from that. So we would be having those discussions as part, we do enrollment projections as we do staffing planning for the end of the year. So I think the only time expenses would be added to the budget would be if we see the need for additional sections. Like if we have to add a section, then you have a teacher expense for that. You have costs of opening up the classroom. So that's the kind of work we would do there. So nothing projected in until we start to see real enrollment come in from there.
I know that we heard the same thing about the promenade, but I think everybody sees lots of kids getting off of buses at the promenade. So maybe that would be like a good, like it might be parallel to what ended up happening there. And then not just worrying about expenditures, but also worrying about maintaining class sizes or even reducing class sizes and not increasing class sizes as well.
Fair enough. I'm not sure we have a ton of enrollment coming from Promenade, so we can certainly double check that. But again, I think the work that the demographer did is based on, studies that the developers did. So again, I don't want to say it's not accurate. I don't know all the details of how they do their studies, but we will certainly monitor that and make adjustments as we need to. But yeah, fair point.
All right, go ahead, Jenna.
Sorry, I missed one on my list. Transfer tax. So this is another one I'll put a question mark next to, as I'm sure you are, because I think this is going to be heavily dependent on mortgage rates. And, again, none of us have a crystal ball for that. It did, though, remind me, on the variance report, I didn't see a separate line item for transfer tax. Was that lumped in with something else?
It would have just been an other, because right now we're projecting it to end up exactly where it's
Okay.
budgeted.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, at this point, I'm not necessarily advocating to change it, because when you look at the comparison to where we're at this year, same budget, I think we kept it the same, right? Yeah. So same budget, we were at 80-something% this time last year, we're at 50-something%. So at this point, I wouldn't advocate to change it unless we start to hear rumblings about, changes in mortgage rates, because obviously that's going to heavily impact transfer tax. So I'm just putting a question mark on it for now, but we don't have a crystal ball.
All right, two minor points from me. You covered on slide 10, one property owner accounts for currently, or was recently 4.8% of total revenue, and now 3.8 tax revenue, not all revenue. And that's a good illustration of why that's something to be concerned about. The thought that came to mind is, well, yeah, but thank goodness we don't have a shopping mall. I think 3.8 is still a big number, but it's not, if we were to compare to other districts, it's not massive. And then the other thing is, I think in this year's budget, at the time we passed the budget because we didn't have a state budget, we put in 25% of the governor's ask, the increase in the governor's ask. And so just you have the numbers here for how much the governor's budget would add to our budget. I don't know what slide it's on, but it's interesting to contemplate. There it is, slide 15, 141,000 in basic ed and 54,000 in special ed. So if we were to add 25% of that, it's not a massive change either way. But is there a timing? Like, if we start with the assumption that the state budget won't be passed by the time we have to pass ours, there will be budget discussions that we'll be able to listen in on and have maybe a sense of direction for where it may go. I liked the strategy of including a percentage of it. Is that something we'd contemplate this year, and when would we contemplate it?
Good question. I wouldn't be opposed to continuing to add 25% in. I think the governor's budget is fresh. I might think we give it another month or two to see how the discussions are going. I think last year, because of how substantial it was, that was why we made the decision to put a percentage in. We knew it wasn't going to be zero, but it was certainly more significant than we expected. So I think we let that go for 1 or 2 months, and then maybe in the proposed final, we bring back a recommendation for what that might look like. But to your point, even 25% is about $50,000. So it's not nothing, but it's not a significant change.
All right, any last comments or questions on this? All right, we look forward to more budget discussions over the next month until we pass our final budget in June. Let's move on to professional services agreement. Lori?
Thank you. So I have been talking with the board regarding communications in the district and the potential for a possible position in district as part of next year's budget, which we're still fleshing out, as you just heard from Mr. Leckman. And something I have also been discussing is, in the interim, the possibility of working with a consulting firm for communication services and narrowing that scope of work, including a communications audit and then some very defined work such as social media, newsletters, other types of things that we need some support with. And we have been looking at different consulting groups. Mr. Held has some experience in that area and has graciously been helping me from his lens. And we've expanded and have some additional consultants that we would like to engage with in the next coming of weeks. However, we certainly will not have a particular consultant to be able to recommend to you by Monday's legislative meeting. And in an effort not to delay us another month, I would like to have a discussion today to answer any questions you may have and then see if the board would be willing to entertain an action item on Monday night's legislative meeting to allow us to enter into an agreement with a consultant once we do that through a vetting process up to a certain amount per month. And we can base that upon what we have heard from some of the consultants that we have already worked with, and certainly Mr. Held's experience based upon the work that we are looking at. So I'm happy to entertain questions, and then, again, am looking to see if you are willing to consider that type of action to allow us to be able to move forward. In the timeline we've put together, my hope would be in that first week in April, we would really be shoring up who this person or consulting firm may be. And we're just looking for this consultant for, whenever we start in early April through June 30th, as we make final decisions about if there will be an internal position created. And Mr. Held, certainly, if there's anything you want to add, go ahead.
So it's been a really interesting process. There are a lot of consultants and agencies that have a lot of experience, but when you start looking at who has experience in K through 12 public education, it's a fairly small pond that you're swimming in. And so we're going to take a look at what those agencies can offer. The intent is to create a rubric to evaluate what they can provide, map it against what our needs are, and hopefully come up with a recommendation.
So to clarify what we're discussing, possibly a motion on Monday night's agenda that would say something on the order of to engage in a contract with a consultant for a term to end June 30th for an amount not to exceed something that we'll hear about on Monday.
Certainly, absolutely, something along those lines. And Mr. Leckman actually reached out to Mr. Diazio to suggest some language for us that would authorize the superintendent to enter into a professional service agreement for communications professional at a cost not to exceed, right now we're thinking $5,000 per month, before the next regular meeting of the school board, meaning the April legislative meeting, and pending final review and approval by the district chief financial officer and solicitor. And of course, you would see the final agreement and then ratify that in April.
Right. Okay. So I think I would like the motion to include a term as well. But with that thought, any comments or questions from anybody? Jeff, why don't you go first if you're ready?
I'm just noodling through the term point. I get the idea that most of our communications are when school's in session, so through June, Dr. Smith. But are we, and I know you're thinking about sort of what the future looks like, but until we get to what the future looks like, is there the possibility that a consultant could do things or make recommendations between now and June that would require work in July? And I'm just kind of thinking out loud to, if we limit ourselves to June, are we coming back then in May to extend it? And should we consider something a little broader to give more flexibility there? I mean, I don't know if that's even a possibility, but either John or Dr. Smith, I just throw that out there for something for us to talk about.
Yeah, well, we can also leave off the term too.
I think it's a very valid point. I really am hoping that in the April presentation that'll be the point that we'll be able to say this is a director position that we are recommending, if that's where we land once we finish our prioritization. And should we then move forward in that direction, there might be a need for an overlap as well. If we do hire our own internal person, to have a consulting firm to work with them and say what they've done and set up and to help them kind of transition in. So there may be that possibility. I know Mr. Held has said in the industry as well, there are sometimes our agreements that are not necessarily an amount per month, but it could be, up to a certain, let's say it's 6 months at $5,000, you could just say up to $30,000 for a time period. So that maybe 1 month is heavier. He mentioned the audit might take a lot more the first month, but then by June, when it's summer, we may not have much at all. So it might be lower. So we could look at how to phrase some of those agreements.
It's you.
Yes, I have a couple of thoughts on this. I do think the idea of getting somebody more sort of focused on communication is important, primarily because I think it takes that component at the moment takes away our professionals' time on teaching and learning. I mean, really, so have, and the role that communication plays is a much larger one now than it was even 5 to 10 years ago. So I think that in my mind makes sense. I would like you to kind of better understand what the directions would be for the audit, because an audit could be this tiny or huge. And I think we need to be quite specific about what it is that we as a district look for. And with that, I think it will be helpful if it is somebody who has some local experience or with districts of this size in Pennsylvania. While that probably doesn't influence how we word things by Monday, I do think that the district needs to make some really specific planning or do some planning of what it is that the district is looking for. Otherwise, they'll spend a ton of time trying to define that for us. I think we should define that for them and then have a conversation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things our intention would be to possibly start interviewing some of the consulting firms next week. And through that process, then really engaging with them and sharing kind of a scope of work, what it is that we would want them, so they can actually create a very thorough proposal based upon what we're really looking for. The proposals that I have so far are pretty broad, and I think we're able to narrow it in a little bit, given that it's a few months we want to look with them. But certainly defining that communications audit, I imagine there's tools out there, and I'm sure Mr. Held has some ideas as well that might be helpful.
What often happens is you'll be offered a scope of work that'll be tiered as well, and it'll say, okay, we can give you A, B, C, and D, and you sort of pick what you want to move forward with. And so I think your point's really well taken, that we don't want to cover the waterfront here, especially knowing this is a bridge to hopefully get us to a full-time position. So what are the most important things that we want to address now? And I think that's what we would focus on with the communications consultant.
Yeah, and at the same time, it will inform us about what potentially that full-time position could look like, might look like, and what it would cost us.
Jenna?
Yeah, so I have a question and a comment. I'll start with the comment. I'm going to echo Titia's comment. I agree. I think we're at the point that having somebody dedicated to this, and it doesn't mean there's not other things that they could also do, but I think it's a big strain to put this on, the superintendent and, other members of administration. So I'm also, I don't want to kind of put the cart before the horse, because I know we're going to do this audit, but just to throw it out there, I'm definitely supportive of having kind of more dedicated resources to communication to free up administration's time to do other things. So that's number one. Number two, just point of clarification. So these services, would this be for an audit and for like interim handling of communication? So it's both.
Yes, it is both. We now have our new official district Facebook page. There's some work on our website, and we certainly have some people in district. Mr. Trantis sitting back there certainly assists with some of these things. Brooke assists with things, but having somebody that is their lens that they bring to everything would be helpful. So I've shared with the board kind of a broader idea of what areas of responsibility could look like. We will narrow that down specifically for a consultant. What is it in the next few months that we would want them? I'd love for them to be in touch with school buildings, departments, what's going on, and really be telling our story. And I think that's something that a consultant could do, much in addition to an audit. Yes.
So for Monday's legislative meeting, what will you have for us to review?
So I won't actually have much more than I have tonight, other than, certainly I have laid out a timeline that we are working on in terms of interviewing the consultants. So I can share a little bit more detail along that, and I can share with you the scope of work that we have just talk through defining for a consultant. The reason really for requesting some action on Monday night is so that we're not waiting another month until April, 22nd, until we could approve a contract. Being able to engage with somebody so that in early April, I can actually start doing some transitioning and getting them up and running prior to that next legislative meeting. March got to be a short month with the spring break in here. We don't have that extra week, so it crunched us a little bit.
So will there be an opportunity to discuss the final contract, final results?
So we would bring back to you in April then. So what we would be asking you to approve on Monday would be to allow us to basically select a finalist, a consultant, and to engage in an agreement with them that I'd basically be able to sign with Mr. Leckman's review and Mr. Diazio's review an agreement. And then we would bring that to you in April for you to ratify that agreement. And certainly we can share through the briefing how it's going. We can, share what that name may be. And if you have concerns or questions, we can answer them along the way.
Anyone else have thoughts? So the one thing I'm trying to understand is, and you hinted at it, but why it feels it's not our usual process for these kinds of things. So what's the big advantage? Why is it important to save the month? What is it about this month that means we can't wait?
Yeah, that's a good, fair question. Yeah. I think I'm going to go back to Mrs. Sherpier's comment in terms of it's just another month of different administrators, support staff doing things that are taking away from other priorities that they could be focusing on. And I think that, it's an extra month for us to be able to get a jump on really promoting our district, cleaning up some things. We have policies that we need to look at as well and look at them from a communications lens. So could we wait another month? We absolutely could. And if that's the board's comfort, I'm happy to do that. We just thought we would engage in a conversation.
To me, that's the only, I'm comfortable with the idea, and I think as everyone has expressed, it's not just to save administrators time to do other parts of their job, it's also to do a better job of communications. And those are, I think, things all of us value, and the relatively small cost of doing this with a consultant for a few months is not, a reason to say no. So I'm all for it, except for just the notion that, this isn't, the usual process. Normally, the board is responsible for ratifying contract or for approving contracts, and so we're sort of short-circuiting that. I think I'm comfortable doing it. I certainly wouldn't want to set a precedent for this as being the usual way we do things, but that it's the change in process, not the substance of it, that to me is the unique special thing here. Jeff.
I mean, I'm comfortable with it. The analogy I drew in my head is we do oftentimes give the administration over the summer, authority to hire people and do things like that, and we come back and ratify in order that we don't fall behind the 8 ball in the summer if there's no meeting. And I kind of am viewing it through that lens that we're advancing something for the benefit of the district here. And I don't think we're really setting a precedent other than to say, when we need to move forward for something good, we adapt. So I'm comfortable moving it forward if everybody else is.
It's certainly not my intent for this to become commonplace at all. I very much appreciate the way that we have been doing business, yeah.
Will we find someone, contract them, and they will start within the 30-day time frame?
They, ideally, if we could have an agreement in place, they would start before the April 22nd. Now, we could work with them too, and maybe, you could speak to the field. Maybe they're willing to engage with us and do some transitioning things before a contract is officially signed on the 22nd. If you want to wait till that board approval occurs, it would all be, dependent upon what they're comfortable with doing with us before having something signed on their behalf.
Most agencies prefer a signed contract in place before commencing work.
Jenna.
So my only hesitation, and again, I guess we'll vote on this on Monday. My only hesitation is because I don't want to put form over substance, but by putting a number out there that we're allowing the administration to go up to, does that sort of predetermine what we're going to end up paying? That's my only hesitation, is if we say, I think you threw out 5,000 a month, we're just picking a number now. Magically, all the bids come in at 5,000 a month. What do you know? So that's kind of my only hesitation in setting a number out there ahead of time. Again, I'm kind of just riffing on this right now, so I'm not sure how that would affect my vote, but that's the one potential negative I'll point out.
We probably technically, I'm not sure it's a good idea, we probably technically could advance a motion on Monday that doesn't include a dollar amount. Putting a lot of faith in the administration not to just execute a contract that's, $5 million a month, but which I'm sure they wouldn't do, but, I mean, we are technically responsible for that decision, so, but we could if we wanted to avoid that scenario. Anyone else? I mean, it sounds like, John, we have, and Lori, we have a sense of where the dollar amounts are likely to come in. Is that right?
This is very much in the ballpark of where most agencies are for this kind of work. And really, there's two different ways that they can structure it. One is a retainer where here's the scope of work, here's the dollar amount, however many hours it takes them is how many hours it takes them. The other is you just go time and expense. So here's their hourly rate, here's how many hours they billed you for, here's what the number is. So those are the two different models that agencies typically use.
And based upon the 3 firms that actually submitted proposals already, I would say 5,000 was the average per month, and the scope of work was much broader in what they presented. So now we're going to be narrowing it. So I think 5,000 is very realistic, even possibly lower. Maybe that first month might be around there, but I see it could be a little lower as well.
Yeah, and if it's time and materials or time accrued until the dollar amount is spent, then that kind of obviates that concern, doesn't it? Okay. So it sounds like we're comfortable with this, and members of the committee, we're good. We'll see what we see on Monday, but.
So do you want a dollar amount in what we put in on Monday, or would you prefer that the action item doesn't have a dollar amount?
I think it should have a dollar amount.
I know I'm playing devil's advocate to my own point here, but I think it's really a tough sell for us. Not that I don't have complete faith in administration, but in our kind of governance role, I think it's really hard for me to just write a blank check. So again, as much as it's helpful to hear that we're pretty clear on what the range should be, I would err more on the side of having the dollar figure in there. I feel like that's kind of our oversight function.
And we could insist that it has a dollar figure and be structured as either time and materials or time accrued. Which I think either one sort of makes it safe. Anyone else? All right, so we're good?
Thank you for the conversation.
Okay. I've gone to sleep. My screen has gone to sleep. I have not gone to sleep. Advanced Protection Company Agreement Amendment.
This is me too. I'm not used to speaking so much at finance. This one is, we currently have an agreement with Advanced Protection Company, APC, for security guards here in district that we contract with this third-party group. There has been a request through the high school, and one that I am very supportive of, and that Mr. Creamer, our safety coordinator, is also supportive of, is to increase by 2 security guards or agents from the hours of 10 to 2 each day. And that really, has been prompted. We've had conversations about some recent behavioral issues at the high school. We value office hours. We are looking at other solutions for what, how we have additional staff present during that time, which is much more unstructured in a building of 1,300. So this is just a request for through the end of this school year. It is not a long-term piece because we will be looking at, what are some of those other options. But this is a proposal for the rest of this year to provide some additional coverage in the high school at this time. And we would be, I believe that Ms. Kitten has actually reached out to APC, and we're working on an agreement that would be an addendum to the existing agreement that we have. And you can see the costs that are associated in the item. Comments or questions?
I'm super supportive of this. And I think it makes sense, for those who aren't as familiar with the schedule, right? This would, as you briefly mentioned, this would cover the office hours portion of the day. So, yeah, I am all in on this.
Itya.
What is the level of training that these individuals will have? Because just having two bodies in is, to me, is not what I would be looking for. I would be looking for some very specific understanding of what their role is, and I would like to understand that a little better.
Yeah, I don't want to misspeak now, so I will go back to the contractor, to ABC, and ask some more. I would imagine that there are certain trainings that they need to go through, de-escalation, different types of pieces, and that's already part of their contract, that they're required to do that. So they would have the same training as the existing guards that are currently coming to us. But I can find that out and put it in a briefing or share at Monday nights, just so that we have an understanding of what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I would also like to understand, a good collaboration with building leadership on that, on what really specifically are the expectations, because obviously there is seems to be an issue that needs to be resolved, but I'd like it to be resolved in a way that's in line with the expectations of the leadership, and not just sort of a punitive, black and white kind of approach to things.
Agreed. And I think, I'll just share, Mr. Creamer has really put together a vision for what, safety and security in terms of personnel could look like. And he has some really good ideas that I think you'll be hearing about in the next couple of months that will hopefully address some of what you've mentioned. But I'll look at that and make sure that I have that for Monday night.
But in the immediate term, I think as a short-term solution through the end of the year, we're talking about doubling the existing staff with the existing capacity and training. And, all of those things I think are important, but we're not talking about here a change of strategy or approach. We need to do a change.
No, I just want to make sure that people who come at short notice for a short period of time will have the same level of training and understanding of what is necessary. And yeah.
Understood.
Okay, so we'll move that forward? Yes, okay, thank you. And we have a settlement stipulation.
We do, and I'm going to spend a couple more minutes on this one than I typically would for settlement stipulations, just because of the significance of it. I don't think it's new information, but I just want to make sure everyone understands. And I think, Mr. Wallach, this does get back to one of the questions that you asked, just to make sure. There is one other item, because we did take this into account before it became an actual assessment appeal. So the settlement before us tonight is for the property, the 2101 Welsh Road, which was the formerly Prudential Insurance. The property was purchased by BET Investments in June of 2022 at a purchase price at a little over $30 million. Again, market value, $30 million. So at the time, the assessed value was such that the implied market value was over $90 million. So this is one, again, back to Mr. Wallach's question, that we actually saw the sale price on a significant property and made a likely assumption that there was going to be appeal here, and did build that into our projections. So this was one that we did do that. So again, knowing that, we were fairly certain we were going to see an appeal, which we did. Our current year budget assumed the worst case scenario, that the assessed value would be valued based on the market value of $30 million. Again, sale price has a lot of weight when it comes to assessed values. So we did assume worst case scenario. Through our negotiation process, you can see here that we ended with a market value of $35 million, which will require a refund this year of about $748,000. If approved again, and next year a market value of $37 million. So that's better than what we had in our projection. So even though we need to write a significant refund of $748,000, we did anticipate that in the budget, actually slightly more than that. It is included in the projections that I presented to you tonight, so it's not like next month we'll see some large reduction, so that was already known. And then next year's revenue numbers, actually what we presented tonight already includes the reduction, which again is slightly less than what we would anticipated. So I think it's a significant increase. It was not unknown, it was planned for. So I'm recommending the approval of this stipulation, and we'll answer any questions if there are any.
So to clarify, because we knew this was coming, even though it's very large, this was budgeted for in the general fund, and therefore it's covered by the general fund, and we would not need to uncommit any funds from our committed fund balance for assessment appeals.
That is correct.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Jeff?
Andy, can you just check one thing before Monday night? You talked about 23 and 24 tax years, about $700,000 each. But if I look on the agreement, the township and the county and the community college have 2 years, and we only have 1. So I'm wondering, is something missing in the agreement that we should fix before we approve it and it's signed, or am I just reading it wrong? So just if you could check that for us.
I will double check that. I do think there was a unique with this one, the dates that it took effect. I think it's typically a July it takes effect, and this is January, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's the difference, because we're on a July to June year and the township is on a January.
Sorry. It is, so it's January for the township
Yep.
and county, but it's July for the school district. Yep.
To be clear, a property can only have one assessed value. It can't have a different assessed value for the school district than it does for other taxing authorities.
So I'm fairly certain it's correct, but I will certainly go back and double check that with our solicitor just to make sure.
Jenna?
So yeah, tying this back to the conversation we had earlier. So just so I'm clear on what you're saying. So if I'm looking at back to slide 9, you don't have to pull it back up, but there's a line item for assessed value. So this is now baked into the assessed value, because there's a separate section on the right-hand side of slide 9 that has assessment changes, but that's separate and apart from this, correct?
Correct. Those are items that are still open that we're anticipating where they'll end up for the budget. Yes.
Okay.
That is correct.
Anyone else? Okay, so we'll move this ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary Beth.
Do we know what the timeline is for the redevelopment of that property and when things might look a little different and assess a little different?
I'm not aware of any plans of that property. I don't know if anyone else is, but we will certainly monitor it, because I certainly don't think, again, I'm going out on a limb here, I don't think BET bought that property to let it sit as a $30 million property. So I think BET does good work in the township, so I think over time it will be improved, but I'm not aware of any current plans.
Yeah, I'll say I'm about 99% sure that nothing has publicly been shared at the township level regarding this property. It doesn't mean there aren't things happening behind the scenes that we wouldn't know yet, but it's possible, but don't know. There are tenants in there, though, that have leases, so they may be waiting that out. Anyone else? All right, so we'll move this ahead? Yeah. Yes, all right, thank you. And so with that, we are through our reports and recommendations, and we're up to public participation. Anyone would like to address the committee, please come up to the mic, state your name and where you reside, and you'll have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I can hear it. Ginny Vitale Ambler, sorry. The traffic study. The township building's under construction. So it's going to be under construction for 2 years. So that eliminates an awful lot of vehicles that are becoming in and out and around and about that whole area. So it seems no matter what study we do now, it is going to be not accurate. And also, is there a point where there'd be so much traffic that we'd be like, oh, we just can't do this because it's just unsafe? Because we can assure you that basically it is unsafe. There has been accidents there. There's been a vehicle that's careened off the 309 ramp into a ditch right by that service area. Thank God it wasn't when someone was walking home from school. So I just wonder, like, I know you have to do it for the township, but it's like pointless because I don't think we'd ever get to a point where we'll say, oh, there's just too much traffic, so we're not going to do it. And it's also not accurate because the whole township building with all this police activity, community activity, and garbage trucks and everything else will be in and out of there, won't be in this study. JLL, who has apparently looked at properties for us, they're a commercial real estate company. I mean, I don't know how they assess a value of a property, whether it's good or not, for us to use a bus depot. So it seems like we need to get an expert. We aren't experts here. We have nobody here that is an expert on a property, whether it's developed good enough for a bus depot. Because what we do know is Fort Washington isn't. We're pushing a square peg in a round hole. And ICS, I think, is not, since they're going to get the job, regardless, it seems, it doesn't seem like they should be the ones to assess a property either. I have concerns that we have not found an expert. If they identify some properties, which there's a multitude of properties, and we're just walking over them and say, oh, no good, because the building doesn't look right, this doesn't look right, it's going to cost money, blah, blah, blah. Because I will argue, of course, that borrowing $10 million and paying $4 million of interest, I'd rather spend $4 million on a property and spend the money and do it right and keep it out of an A residential area. So I just don't think it should be ICS and JLL. I think we should hire an outside expert. Of the $1 million that we approved ICS to spend on this bus depot, starting the planning of the process at Fort Washington, can we get an ongoing how much we've spent of that $1 million, kind of keeping track of where we are spending the money, or will it come up like we're spending $32,000 on a traffic study? Quite frankly, we haven't talked about Jarretttown renovation project, or we're kind of talking the conversation. To me, where we house 400 some elementary age students and a significant part of our staff, or 1/4 of our elementary staff, and also the whole goal of our district is education of our students, I would think that the prioritizing Jarretttown and fixing it would be on top of whether my bus drivers have a break room middle of the day when they should just go home. Anyway, but that's me. So also BET, which is interesting that they are #1 taxpayer. The president of that BET sits on our Upper Dublin Township Municipal Authority, which I find completely and totally inappropriate and conflict of interest. And keep that in mind. The goal of the township appears to be we're going to build more and more apartment buildings, which is also a problem for us finding a space for a bus depot, because that's not their goal. So you see how this BET is reducing the taxes they pay for us, even though they have most of our properties. He sits on the authority that decides what to do inside that industrial park. And it kind of holds our hands tight, but don't fall for it. I really beg you. We don't want a bus depot in a residential area. It is going to be unsafe, no matter what the traffic study says. That's it, thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Joan Frizzell. I just retired from teaching pathophysiology and pharmacology in a local university for more than 32 years. So I'm very interested in education, academia, and what happens with the current students. I also have to say I'm a nurse practitioner. And for those of you who don't know, I grew up in Philadelphia, North Philly, with my dad being on the Philadelphia Police Department. So a couple of things that I feel need to be looked at, and that is the study is currently not addressing the fact of the large number of cars that are double parked on Highland Avenue, double parked on Fort Washington Avenue, And the fact that many of the parents dropping off and picking up kids use an access lane off of Highland Avenue, so that having to pull in and out of Stewart Creek Farm in the morning is an interesting experience. I do my best in the morning to avoid Fort Washington Avenue and Highland Avenue. I kind of drive away from where the schools are because of the large amount of traffic that's currently there. So one of the things I would echo with Ginny is, at what point do we decide there's such a large amount of traffic there that maybe using a residential area adjacent to an elementary school is not the best option? My other concern is safety. Safety in the schools, and what are we teaching the students about anger management? Is there a class on anger management? Is there information given to students to help them solve problems in a different way rather than fighting? I went to Cook Junior High at the time I was there. We averaged in the school several fights in the school, fights on the way home, people waiting for you as you left the building to attack you on your way home. So I know that there's things that the school district and teachers and health classes can do to work with students to try to develop a mechanism, anger management, etc. I also am very concerned about school safety. I worked in North Philly, and to enter this building tonight, there is nobody monitoring where I came in. Where did I go? Did I take an elevator? Did I take stairs? There's nobody monitoring. Is everybody who entered the building leaving at the end of the meeting, or is somebody hiding in a restroom or in a vacant room or somewhere else within the building? There's nothing. Anybody can walk in during this meeting and go anywhere they want. There's nobody monitoring that access. And as somebody that lives in Upper Dublin, somebody who has a variety of experiences. I'm also a nurse practitioner, and I worked as a nursing supervisor. So I can tell you lots of stories about safety and access based on my own experience. I am concerned that there's nobody looking at safety and access for this building during the meeting. And who enters, who leaves, did everybody sign in? Did everybody sign out? Thank you very much.
Okay, seeing no one else coming to the mic, I will close public participation and note that we did not receive any written comments ahead of this meeting. Let's see if there's any responses, starting with the administration. Okay, anyone on the board have any final comments? I'd just like to comment one thing regarding doing the traffic study during the township building construction. In that intake meeting, I wonder if we could have them also review, presumably the township has done a traffic study on their project, and therefore they have data on, estimated data on their own traffic, and I wonder if that can be incorporated. So that's maybe an additional thing to bring up during that meeting. So with that, our next Finance Committee meeting will be held on Wednesday, April 17th at 6 p.m., probably here in the Cardinal Room. And with that, we are adjourned.